Hello, everyone. Today we are talking about prohibition. Perhaps no more exciting topic of the 19th, well, top 10 at least. But let's talk about prohibition. So, the United States from 1920 to 33, now that would be 13 years for those of you that struggle with math, got rid of alcohol, sort of, kind of. And that's going to be called prohibition. Now, the nickname, according to Herbert Hoover, was this is a noble experiment. We're going to see if this works. Noble, of course, meaning we're trying to do something really good, idealistic, awesome. But immediately people like to fight, so they broke into two groups, the dries and the wets. The wets being, hey, let's drink that wet liquid, and the dries being, no. So again, people like to fight about everything, right? Now, this is the only amendment. Now, there's 27 amendments to our Constitution that actually took freedom away rather than trying to safeguard it, which makes it kind of an interesting amendment. This whole amendment that set up prohibition. Now, why would we do that? Why would we pass an amendment, the 18th Amendment, to take freedom away from ourselves? Well, let's look into it. That's what this presentation's about. Now, the answers are interesting, so we are going to find them out. And to do that, we got to look at how the amendment came to be. So we're going to look at the history right now. Now, the origins of the movement to establish prohibition, let's go all the way back to 1830. Now, Americans back in the early 1800s drank about 300% more than they do today. Now, that is a significant difference because people actually drink quite a bit today as well, those above 21 and all. So why was there so much drinking? Now, the number one reason was it was the industrial age, and at that time, the government did a little laissez-faire thing where they didn't watch businesses. So what did businesses do? They polluted the environment at an exponential rate. Now, all that pollution went into the water, and water was gross. In fact, it was kind of disgusting and unhealthy. So the solution for most people was to put liquor in the water, and that would kill the bacteria. So people drank liquor all the time, almost like it was water. Now, the number two reason why people drank a lot is today homes are relatively large, at least compared to 1830 when they were extremely small for most people. Here's a picture of the tenements, which we've talked about. And those rooms were like one room for a whole family or three families. There was no room just to hang out. So what did men do after working? They went to the saloon because it was much more spacious and relaxing. So all of that excessive drinking that came from that unhealthy water and lack of room led to the temperance movement. Now, the temperance movement describes a movement of people to get rid of alcohol. Now, it's going to be a 90-year movement, so progress takes a long time sometimes, and it's going to be to eliminate alcohol from our society. Now, why were the temperance people, the temperance movement, why were they against drinking? Well, it's a complicated discussion. They were against alcohol, and the number one reason was because it led to alcoholism. A lot of people struggled, and that created health issues for so many Americans. Now, the number two reason the temperance movement was fighting against alcohol, slothfulness. Basically, just people becoming unproductive. Drinking was making them lazy. And one label from the Delaware Moral Society was, we were becoming a nation of drunkards. Public drunkenness all over the streets. Basically, it looked like alcohol was destroying our society. Mondays in particular, a lot of people wouldn't show up to work, or they'd show up and be miserable. So a lack of productivity economically. A lot of people blamed alcohol for the loss of jobs, unemployment. And of course, unemployment leads to poverty and the destruction of the family. So people blamed poverty on alcohol. They blamed, the economy hurting on alcohol. Vagrancy, homelessness, and there was certainly an element of that they blamed on alcohol. A third reason, besides those economic impacts that temperance people were against alcohol, was its effect on marriage and the family. Basically, a lot of people would drink excessively and then come home and get violent. And there is something to that, people drinking and then becoming more aggressive. And that they would take that on their children, their wives. Of course, men were the ones predominantly drinking at this point. Now, this was a time where there really wasn't divorce. So if a male was violent mentally or physically, you couldn't escape that. The children and the wife were stuck. Maritable rape was not a thing at this point. Men would come home and get violent or even sexually violent. There was no recourse for a wife. They would just have to live with that. And of course, that's going to lead to a lot of protests to get rid of alcohol. And the fourth reason why the temperance movement wanted to get rid of alcohol, it was deemed as sinful. Just everything we just talked about, sinful. not following the path of God. But also where you found saloons and places to drink, that's also where you'd find gambling, which people interpreted as bad from the sake of religion and whatnot. You'd also find prostitution, which was very sinful and located in saloons and whatnot. So the temperance movement really wanted to get rid of alcohol because of that sinful behavior that went along with drinking. Now, another reason, it just hurt families beyond just wives, and paydays would typically be Fridays at that point. And what would the men do? They'd go to the bar, the saloon on Fridays, and spend all of that money. Now, when the husband comes home with a week of wages, but now it's gone because he spent all of it, there was no money left for food. And this was at a time where government did not help people. So if you didn't have money, you were done. It was over. No recourse. No working man ever drank a glass of rum who did not rob his wife and children of the price of it. So again, a zero-sum game here. You drink, you hurt your family, and people were drinking. Here's a cartoon showing family outside the saloon. Daddy's in there, along with any money that would have paid for shoes, stockings, clothes, our food. Very sad situation. Here's another ad, a temperance movement ad. This child has no chance if people are drinking. The saloons are killing the children. Indirectly, of course. The temperance movement also was against alcohol because not just your temporary wages, but your life savings. Alcohol would destroy you by taking away your job, you'd spend at the saloon. It would have both short-term and long-term effects. Another reason the temperance movement was against drinking, typically that poverty led to crime. When people don't have money, they get desperate and they make terrible decisions, and a lot of the crime that goes on. So again, come from these bad choices that groups of men were making when they were all aggressively together and drinking. So crime was blamed on drinking. Poverty was blamed, all because of that saloon behavior. When men would go to the saloons, they'd rile each other up and make terrible decisions. Number 8 reason why the temperance movement hated alcohol. This was only towards the end when cars were starting to get going. Drunk driving started to occur. And obviously, when you drunk drive, you not only can hurt yourself, but hurt others. And that became a thing. 9th reason why the temperance movement was very much against alcohol. There was even a racist concern. Now, this gets complicated, but our country is as bad as racism and prejudice is today. It was so much exponentially worse 100 years ago. And I don't like comparing bad behavior, but basically another concern, people were getting freaked out, temperance leaders, of black saloons, basically where African Americans were hanging out drinking. Our society was very, very racist at this point, and African Americans were depicted at this point by racists, particularly black men, as being lustful and going after white women and going to attack white children. And if a group of black men were meeting at saloons, drinking excessively and becoming drunk, they were becoming so very, very dangerous. And you look at all these temperance organizations that history often says were trying to do such positive things. And if you look at their literature, this is in their literature that they were passing out. The black saloon, we need to get rid of alcohol because it's making African Americans dangerous. And it is a completely racist point of view. But that was one thing that temperance leaders were trying to convince the public why they needed to get rid of alcohol, to keep themselves safe, to prevent black crime. And again, it's just another example of an ugly history of prejudice that taints every aspect of our history today. So we just talked about why the temperance movement was founded, why they hated alcohol and feared the use of alcohol. Now let's talk about who led the temperance movement. And it wasn't party-based like so much that happens today, Republicans, Democrats, and so on. It just wasn't. Both parties were split about alcohol. So who actually led the temperance movement? Women were the primary leaders. Now, this was a high stakes issue for women. It meant a lot to them. Why? Because they were deemed the protectors of the family, and the men that were drinking were hurting families. So they had a lot to protect. And at this time, they were completely dependent on men. So when men screwed up and drank and became slothful and just a waste, they really got hurt. The family got hurt. Now, there is an obstacle to women leading this movement. They weren't allowed in politics at this point. Literally weren't involved. They weren't allowed to vote, but drinking was seen as a moral issue, which was a church issue. And that allowed female leadership to take a leadership role because they were allowed to do church work and even lead church activities. That opened the door for women to lead the temperance movement. Now, Besides women who led the temperance movement, Protestants, huge roots in the Protestant religion, kind of puritanical roots where there's this certain way to live a godful life to avoid temptation and bad things like alcohol, cigarettes, things like that. So the puritanical roots of American Protestantism is very much going to lead Protestants to be more against drinking and to support the temperance movement. Also, the prejudice that Protestants, kind of the founders of the United States, had against Catholics, and so many immigrants coming in were Catholics, that also said, you know what, Catholics like to drink more, kind of true in the late 1800s, a cultural generalization I just made. So Protestants that were trying to be puritanical, this was another excuse to double down on their prejudice against Catholics. So who led the temperance movement besides women and Protestants? Rural people. People not living in the city, but in the rural areas of the country, they had these old school values that were saying, no, there's this one way to live, this very religious way. So rural areas tried to stick to the way it was and get rid of alcohol. And they looked at those city people, the people in the cities as leading this corrupt new way to live, led by kind of this immigrant culture that had been coming into the country. And it was un-American and we need to stop it. So rural people tended to be for prohibition and to support the temperance movement. So again, they were defending those traditional values. So who led the temperance movement? Nativists, without a doubt. Americans that lived in the America, and they were so very full of prejudice towards newcomers, new immigrants coming in that looked very different and acted very different. Now, nativists were scared of this immigrant culture, which embraced alcohol in the saloon more than in the past. They were scared of that taking over the US. And at this time, immigration was radically expanding, and that was making nativists so unbelievably fearful. If you look at the history of immigration in the United States in the late 1800s, all the way right up to when Prohibition was enacted, immigration massively went up. And nativists saw this as a takeover of the United States, and they were so very angry and scared that they wanted to get rid of this aspect of culture from immigrants. They looked down upon it. So immigrants brought in all this culture to the US. And if you study these the groups that were coming in, whether they were the Irish, the Italians, the Greeks, if you looked, alcohol played a much stronger role in their lives than the Protestants that founded the United States, whether it was socializing all the time in beer gardens or dances, baptisms, picnics, weddings. Their activities seem to revolve around alcohol. And that's a cultural thing. That's why this wave of immigration led to kind of an increase of drinking, and that is going to be alarm the nativists and give them ammunition for their prejudice. So all that hate and prejudice, who led the temperance movement? Also, it was wealthy versus the less wealthy. By that, many wealthy people thought there was a very proper way to drink. This image really demonstrates it. And the way not to drink was what was happening in these saloons, this lower class drinking that led to these people becoming with no class, acting with no class. And that's what they wanted to get rid of, the saloon. That really the wealthy drank in these very formal dinner parties and didn't go to these bars at this time. So it was a classist type of prejudice. They looked at something like this and say, well, that's what's happening in those saloons of those lower classes. So Protestants, women, the wealthy, nativists, rural people united together to lead the temperance movement to fight against this evil that is known as drinking. And of course, I have emphasized that prejudice played a huge role in that. Now, let's talk, that was informal, let's talk formal. All of those groups are going to unite in two-prong attack: the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League. These are two organizations that form, and they're going to be tangibly fighting against alcohol, leading the temperance movement. In 1873, the WCTU was formed, again, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they're going to have chapters, what they called unions, all over the United States. You can see little dots all over the place. And what they pretty much did was they harassed saloon customers. They went there and just like yelled at them, lectured them, what are you doing? And they had pray-ins. Here's a picture of the group doing pray-ins in front of a saloon, basically praying for those people, also providing a little pressure on them. Here's another pray-in in front of a billiard hall that served alcohol. Same thing here. You can see the women on the bottom of the screen, and of course the saloon frequenters on the top of the screen, kind of an adversarial little situation. Now here's that group again. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours, of course, using a little influence and pressure there. Always like that picture. That's what they did. They focused on fighting alcohol. And here's another picture again. There's an advertisement for a type of beer, and here the WCTU is kind of put up their own sign. Don't be deceived. This beer doesn't serve God in any way. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they fought, but many people thought they were way too Christian and way too nice and way not radical enough. So the Anti-Saloon League formed in 1893, a few years later, and they're going to be a little more radical. They're going to be a little more aggressive, and they're going to be much more powerful, and they're given much more of the credit for establishing prohibition, being more in. They're going to be huge into agitation and confrontation, being a lot more aggressive. Now they're going to be younger, but one huge thing that they did was they made pamphlets and created a lot of literature about why alcohol was bad, all the things we talked about, and they're going to distribute it endlessly, just about everywhere. They would talk to organizations and say, can we put this literature in every single paycheck? And they got the word out. They really advocated. Now, another thing that they did, the Anti-Saloon League, was they did aggressive lobbying. They went after every political candidate, said, are you for alcohol or against, a wet or a dry? And they aggressively tried to get people to vote one way or the other. And that's going to pay some dividends. They're going to get a lot of people elected, a lot of people not elected. Now, a third influencer, which is just a person, not a group, is somebody by the name of Carrie Nation. Now, in 1881, Kansas actually got rid of alcohol. They banned it. Now, that's about 40 years before the country banned it, but they banned it. And when they banned alcohol, it was ignored. The leaders of Kansas, there were bars everywhere, and they didn't do anything about it. And it was against the law. So Carrie Nation said, well, if you're not going to enforce the law, I am. So claiming that God had talked to her directly, she started some early protests. She taunted the bar people, yelling at them, making life uncomfortable. She then serenaded the saloon patrons, singing to them to make them uncomfortable, and that completely failed. And so then she got a little more aggressive. So everything she was trying didn't work. So she got a bunch of rocks that she called smashers. I'm not sure what she did with it. Oh, yes, she walked in. She started smashing all the bottles with those smashers and those rocks. Now, men, I have come to save you from your drunken fate. I'm sure they didn't think they were being saved at the time, but she did, which is all that's important. Now, immediately her husband said, you should use a hatchet next time for maximum damage. And she said, that is the most sensible thing you have said since I married you. He said, I was joking. I don't care. It's smart. But she took the idea. She got a hatchet. She knew that for marketing purposes, and she needed a symbol. So she used a hatchet, and that was the way that she was depicted. She walked into over 100 saloons with a bunch of supporters eventually, smashing up everything with her hatchet. And she's like, hey, you're open illegally. Government can't do anything to me. Well, they kind of could. They arrested her over 30 times, but every time she made the press, she became a national hero to some. Now, she was using violence, right? Not against people, but kind of. So is violence a good choice for protest? In one way, a lot of people are against violence, and you'll lose a lot of supporters if you're violent. On the other hand, if you use violence, you capture people's attention and your ideas spread and you can gain supporters. So I typically do not advocate for violence, but that is a question for everybody when you're trying to do something good. Is violence ever acceptable? And I would tend to say no, but there are exceptions maybe. Our revolution for one, who knows? Now, were they successful? The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, Carrie Nation? Now, state by state, they start making progress. Now, in 1851, Maine gets rid of alcohol, then Vermont, then Kansas, then Iowa, then North Dakota, South Dakota, then a bunch of other states. And it goes all the way up to 1913, this battle, this temperance battle, where they keep getting some states to get ban alcohol completely. But in 1913, they start getting even more momentum. That's a huge date, 1913. Even wet states that still allowed alcohol, a lot of times, a lot of counties within the states had banned alcohol. So even wet states, a lot of them couldn't drink either. So in 1913, the temperance movement's almost at the finish line. They almost have the whole country, sort of. But they have a problem because some states still allow alcohol, about half at this point. People can just go to those other counties or those other states or those other towns, buy alcohol and bring it back. So they don't really feel like they're winning, the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So they try a new tactic. They want to change their strategy. And they change the direction to, instead of fighting state by state, they say the only way this will work is if we get the whole country to ban alcohol. So they go for a constitutional amendment, and that will ban it everywhere, not just in little places. And now in the past, they failed. They weren't able to get the whole country to do this. But from 1913 to 1919, we had changed. Something had changed. So why did they get more success during this 1913 period of time than they ever had before? Why are they going to find a pathway to victory to gain momentum? So about 5 reasons. The temperance movement gets a final big push. Number one, because laissez-faire began to die in our country. I would argue that Teddy Roosevelt played a huge role here. From 1800 to 1900, the government basically did not feel it was its job to run people's lives. But in 1906, under the spirit of progressivism, which of course we studied, they started just passing laws, basically controlling and protecting the American people from everybody, whether it was the meatpacking industry, whether it was drug producers, maybe from prostitution. So basically our government got really used to a culture of saying we need to do things to protect people from themselves even. So that became a thing. Laissez-faire started to die. And so we're almost there again. That's almost going to get the country comfortable with banning alcohol. But what's another reason in 1913 we started having more success getting rid of alcohol? Nativists just started getting more and more upset. Immigration had never been higher as compared with the 1800s than right before World War I, right around 1913. And this was freaking out nativists. They thought they were losing their country. So they were getting lots of anxiousness. And of course, nativists associated drinking with immigration, which had some truth to it, and beer consumption was massively going up, exponentially so. People were drinking so much more beer than they had, and people drank beer in saloons, and there were so many more saloons established in the 20 years before 1913. So it was just right up in the face of nativists, these traditional, very white Protestant people saying the saloons are growing, they're loud, they're boisterous, and we need to get rid of this problem right now. So nativists were mobilized to get rid of alcohol as kind of a form of prejudice. And another reason why they got more success in those final years, the U.S. government had an activist spirit, which we talked about earlier, but the previous 40 years, the U.S. government really never changed the Constitution. It was like gold to them. And suddenly, as of 1913, in just 6 years, when the previous 40, they did nothing, they now passed 4 amendments. So the U.S. government was really like, you know what, we're going to fix this Constitution. And that attitude is going to make them willing to pass an amendment to ban alcohol. So again, temperance movement's almost there. Now, what's another reason why they had success in these final years? Now, the government has been pretty active, and we talked about that. But here's the thing. The government has always been active trying to do things which cost money. And all of the things the government does, thousands of them, are expensive. And before 1913, taxes on alcohol, they're called exercise taxes, represented 30% of the government's budget. Well, the problem is, or the good thing is, after 1913, the 16th Amendment had been passed. It was passed in 1913, which allowed the government from then on to have an income tax, to tax the incomes of Americans. So now the government had a source of income, and that meant they didn't need excise taxes on alcohol. So you could ban alcohol and it wouldn't bankrupt the government. So you really couldn't have the 18th Amendment until you had the 16th Amendment. Now, once again, that got the temperance movement so close. What's another example? Well, number 5, urbanization. I just wanted to urbanization had been occurring the previous 40 years, the growth of cities. Now, as of 1920, this was the first point that more people lived in cities than lived in rural areas. Now, you would think that would make temperance movement less successful. However, there was something called malapportionment. You see that word on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. Complicated thing. Even as more and more people were moving to the cities, all the districts that elect people into Congress stayed the exact same. So you had all of these, if you look at my mouse, all of these counties and districts that have so many less people, but they all have the same amount of voting power that they used to. So hardly anybody would live here, yet they would have a full representative in Congress. And the same thing for all these. And where all these people lived here, they only would have 1 vote for Congress, which meant that all the people in our Congress, or most of them, were advocating for rural interests, and rural people were more into prohibition. Now, the urban area, which were full of immigrants and people that would have hated prohibition, they got less votes. Now, this malapportionment is going to become very important when it comes to civil rights and equal justice. However, it started here. We never would have passed prohibition if it was kind of a one person, one vote type of thing. But our apportion system was so very unfair. And that is going to matter. Absolutely. Rural people had more power, a disproportionate amount of power in Congress. Now, again, just added to the temperance movement being successful. And the final reason, World War I. This is going to do it. This is going to push temperance movement into success. During World War I, we needed all of that food for the troops, for our allied troops. And instead of using all that barley to make whiskey. So we passed a law that basically said, you know what, you can't use food to make whiskey anymore. And that is going to be like a dagger in the heart of people that like alcohol. So again, the quote, shall the many have food or should the few have drink? And will you back me? Vote for me. I'm a soldier. Get prohibition. Don't vote for drinking. So it became your patriotic duty pretty much to get rid of alcohol for the good of the troops, good of the war. World War I also, it created a huge amount of nativism, anti-German prejudice, because Germany was our enemy in the war. And Germany was the #1 beer producer. If you found breweries in the United States or even bars, typically they were German bars, German breweries. So people associated drinking, particularly drinking beer, with Germans. And then therefore, it was, again, almost your patriotic duty to support prohibition, to go against the evil enemy that we were facing. So World War I just made the temperance movement successful. As of 1919, 26 states had banned alcohol. That's a lot more than 1913. The final push, here we see some literature created by those groups we talked about. Which gets your vote, mother or the saloon? Vote dry. The time has come for the federal government to banish the worst enemy of civilization from shore to shore. Here we have the children. Are you going to vote for the children for their sake to have prohibition? Again, here's a girl crying basically while her dad's off drinking. You're going to vote for the dad drinking or the girl and her family? So again, parades occurred, protests, vote dry, get rid of alcohol. So in 1919, it happens. The Congress proposes the 18th Amendment, the 18th change to our Constitution, and 2/3 of Congress is needed to support it. And do they get it? And they do. So both the Senate and the House of Representatives vote, 68%, 76%. Again, they needed 67% to pass this amendment. Now, once the Congress passes an amendment, which happened, then it has to go to the states. 3/4 of the states need to support an amendment. Now, they got 95.8% of the states to support the amendment. Most had already banned alcohol anyway. Now, the two states that did not support prohibition, Rhode Island and Connecticut, of course, both adjacent to the Massachusetts. I don't know what that means, but either way, bam, prohibition established. The nation votes itself dry, and the 18th Amendment is implemented. Now that brings us to the very round number of 1920 when prohibition starts. Now the 18th Amendment is just a couple lines of text. People can ignore that. So they have to pass a law to enforce it, and that's going to be like thousands of pages. The Volstead Act, hundreds if not thousands of pages where they figure out how to enforce the 18th Amendment. Now the Volstead Act is a law. It's super complicated. Now let me explain the first part of it. Immediately, saloons, you're gone. You're closing up. You can't exist. Now, breweries, you're closing up. So during Prohibition, that happened. Now, some breweries found other things to do. Anheuser-Busch and Yuengling, the #1 American beer company right now, started making ice cream. And Coors started making pottery somehow. I don't know. But many of these companies still made near beer, which is basically non-alcoholic beer. It had to have less than 0.5%. But a lot of companies transitioned to making soda, which of course has had a great effect on the health of our country. But that's when soda really took off. And #2, part of the Volstead Act, the U.S. Treasury Department was given the power to enforce prohibition at the federal level. So they just hunted it, searched for it, all this illegally produced alcohol. Here you have a bunch of pictures of people finding it and dumping it out, destroying it. I'm sure they're all very happy. #3 part of the Volstead Act is ships that carried alcohol were allowed to still use the U.S.-owned Panama Canal, which was very important to get around. However, if they were carrying alcohol, they were not allowed to go to a single U.S. port. So ships, if you want to trade with the United States, which is an economically positive thing, you better not have alcohol on your ships. So that was a thing. Number 4, part of the Volstead Act. Now, the 18th Amendment just said not that you couldn't drink alcohol. It just said you can't make it, sell it, or transport it. You could actually still own alcohol and drink it. So many people, particularly upper middle class and rich, had the money to buy as much alcohol as possible in the days right before the 18th Amendment took place, got enacted. Just buy as much as they could. Now there was a lot of private clubs were established where they just had alcohol, and if you paid a membership fee, you could drink as much as you want. It wasn't like you were buying it; they weren't transporting it because they got it ahead of time. One group, the Yale Club of very rich people, actually stocked up enough for 13 years, which was the entire time of Prohibition. Now, this turns out to be not an equitable situation at all, because of course only the wealthy could afford to stockpile that much alcohol. And the saloons that had closed down was where the less than wealthy people went. They were the ones impacted while the rich got away with it. So that created a lot of anger. Now, some people were frustrated with this whole 18th Amendment. This was a trick pulled over us while we were basically distracted by the war. And there's some truth to that. We fought for liberty during World War I, and we want some liberty here. Let us drink. We are citizens, not inmates. Another thing that was often said. The toiler is worthy of his recreation. That's a fancy way of saying if you work hard, you should be allowed to play hard too. What a bunch of jerks. Well, not them, but so there's protests all around the country, including a huge one at Boston Common, people wanting beer. Now, a lot of people say, hey, this is not fair. It's you don't blame drink for everybody's drunkenness any more than if somebody's chubby, you don't blame food, you blame them for eating too much food or having too much alcohol. You don't get rid of alcohol. Moderation is the key. Doesn't matter. All these thoughts, too bad. It's happening. It did happen. So some resistance naturally happens. When people are angry, they don't just go along. So let's talk about that resistance. Now, the Volstead Act did create an industrial exception. They said, you know what? We're not banning all alcohol. You need alcohol for things like to produce aftershave or, mouthwash or perfumes or adhesives like glue. So they did allow alcohol to be used for products, whether detergents. There are thousands of examples of where alcohol is needed to be part of these products being created. So, of course, a lot of factories would get a bunch of alcohol and then use some of it for production, but then sneak it to other people. So that's one way that people got around the law. Another example of the Volstead Act was religion. Basically, at that time, Judaism, but also Christianity, used wine or alcohol as part of their services. So if you were a priest or a rabbi, you were allowed to order as much alcohol as you wanted. Suddenly, there was an exponential increase in the number of people that were rabbis because, if you were to say you were a rabbi or even a priest, who's to say you weren't? There was no proof. So basically, there was no test you had to take. So suddenly, there was so many more rabbis and so many more priests and so many people attending church. And they were suddenly getting a massive amount of alcohol. Now, another thing the Volstead Act did was the medicinal exception. Basically, you were allowed to get alcohol, whiskey, for medicinal purposes, medical purposes. Now, in New York City, the number of registered pharmacists that, in charge of medicine tripled. Suddenly, we needed 3 times more. I don't know why. It could be to illegally get alcohol, perhaps. So in the United States, a pandemic occurred, not COVID, but just everybody started getting sick, things like the flu. So that and you for the flu or even mental health, you could get alcohol. All you had to do was get a shady doctor, and then they would write a prescription. And every 10 days, you were allowed to get a massive amount of whiskey. Now, an example of this in 1919, Walgreens only had 20 stores. Now today, they're the biggest pharmacy. In 1920, saloons were closed by the 18th Amendment, and so Walgreens decided to sell medicinal whiskey. And in 1929, they now had 525 stores. Everybody went there. So with the doctor's note. So you could say that Walgreens, the #1 pharmacy in the world, much bigger than CVS, basically they owe their success, you could say, to prohibition and then skirting the law. Now, there were a bunch of lawbreakers too that didn't use those loopholes, just straight up broke the law. Now, #1, they were called bootleggers, people that actually sold or transported alcohol illegally. Bootlegger comes from kind of the Civil War where people would sneak alcohol into their military camps and they would sneak it in their huge boots, putting their flasks. So that's kind of where bootlegger comes from, bootlegger. Now, most of the alcohol was smuggled in from Canada, but a lot came in from Cuba and the Caribbean. And bootleggers would use fancy trucks like this to hide their alcohol, even milk trucks. Here in the rural areas, they stuffed pig carcasses with whiskey, which is kind of weird. Here's a woman smuggling across the border, as you can see, with her big fur coat. Same thing. This is how she got over the border with the alcohol. This woman hid it in her cane. So a lot of trickery going on. Now, and that's another example of illegal action, speakeasies. Bootleggers would sell alcohol at speakeasies. Speakeasies was a fancy name for a bar. Here's a speakeasy. They seem very ashamed of breaking the law. Now, a lot of times speakeasies weren't huge. Sometimes they would just be a back room or something in your basement where you would invite people to drink. A lot of times it was like this. They'd open up the little hatch and see if you were legit or not. You'd have to have a password. Now, speakeasy comes from, hey, you need to speak easy, speak quietly, don't let the cops know. Although that's not such a big deal because in most cases the police went to speakeasies too, and they usually took bribes to let them exist. Everybody knew where they were. Another nickname for a speakeasy was a blind tiger or a blind pig. Or a striped pig was another huge nickname, and that has kind of so if you go to a striped pig, you're going to a speakeasy, an illegal alcohol place. Now, why was it called a striped pig? Well, in 1838, there was this town in Massachusetts called Dedham, and Dedham actually banned alcohol, just that one town. And when they banned alcohol, somebody had a really good idea. They said, you know what? Okay, I'm not allowed to sell alcohol. That's the key. So I'm going to get a pig. I'm going to paint stripes on it. And when I paint stripes, I'm going to charge people to come and look at my pig. And when they charge that fee, I'll just give them alcohol for free. So I'm not selling them alcohol. I'm selling them their ability to look at my pig. And that was the way they got around that whole law about selling beer. They gave free beer out. Total sketchy. But number 3, people that were willing to break the law, rural areas. Hiding beer is difficult in rural areas because beer is huge. It's got this huge volume to it. So they said, you know what, we can't illegally make beer. We're going to make whiskey instead. But they also made bathtub gin. So these were things that they could make because it was very concentrated alcohol. It was smaller, easier to hide. And besides bathtub gin, moonshine was a type of alcohol that they were making. Moonshine is essentially just illegal whiskey made by people. And it got its name from when they banned alcohol in Britain back in like the 1600s. People would make it in the middle of the woods. And the only way they could make it was when there was a full moon out because that provided enough light for them to see. So it's called moonshine for this illegal whiskey being made. They typically would make it in the middle of the woods during Prohibition, and Prohibition agents would have to search the middle of the woods to find them and so on. Now, this is a still. Basically, this is how you make it. I'll explain how the still works, but this is how you make whiskey. The moonshiners would often wear boots like this because they knew the Prohibition agents were searching for their footprints to find their stills, their distilleries. And so they would wear this. And if you look on the bottom of the shoe, it actually has 2 cow hoofs. So it looks like they're cow prints, not people's prints, right? Now, from 1920 to 1933, moonshine would be very dangerous. They would create unsafe alcohol. Now, normally you had professionals making moonshine. Now you just have these amateurs out in the middle of the woods. Now, why was that dangerous? Well, I'm explaining the distilling process. What you would do is you would take a bunch of stuff and you would put it here together, and that would grow some alcohol, and you would evaporate the alcohol and it would be collected here, and then you would drink it or sell it and so on. So let's talk about that distillery process a little more specifically. You would add yeast, sugar, and then heat that up. And that heat would allow the yeast to eat the sugar, and as a byproduct, it would make a lot of alcohol. Now, that alcohol that you could sell, right? Now, the problem is too high of alcohol actually kills the yeast, and now you're done. So what they would have to do is they would have to evacuate the alcohol as it got made so that it wouldn't kill the yeast so you could keep making alcohol. So that's a tough distilling process. Now, water evaporates at 212 Fahrenheit, but alcohol evaporates at 173. So you can actually just evaporate the alcohol easily, take it away from the water. Now, there's a problem with this, though. As part of that yeast, you have all these other things, and those things also evaporate. And the problem is they evaporate earlier than the alcohol. So when you set up a distillery, all the bad stuff that can cause you to go blind or kill you evaporates first. Now, if you're really good at this, every single thing that evaporates prior to 172 degrees, you need to get rid of, because if you leave that in the liquid, that could kill people. Now, professionals know to do that. However, if you're out in the middle of the woods and you don't get rid of all that, then you're in trouble. You're basically selling a liquid that can cause blindness, death, and it put thousands of Americans into hospitals. And that's moonshine. When people make their own alcohol, you got to be careful. If it's whiskey and they distill it wrong, if they don't get rid of that stuff that evaporates early, you could get hurt, and people did get hurt. So another explanation of people that were breaking the law were rum runners. Now, bootleggers snuck alcohol over land. Rum runners did it over water. And a lot of times they came from the Caribbean. Now, every country owns the water around them up to 3 miles. Then you're in international waters. So from 1920 to 1933, a line of boats all hung out 3 miles outside of the US on the eastern seaboard. It was called the rum line because a lot of times they were selling rum, at least initially. So at sunset, when things got dark, immediately a bunch of rum runners would get these small little boats and they would head out. Now, the reason they use small boats is with 2 engines, a small boat can move a lot faster than a large boat, so they could outrun the US Coast Guard. Nothing they could do about it. There's also a massively long coastline, so the Coast Guard couldn't patrol at all. And if the Coast Guard ever came close to a boat, they would dump the alcohol over the side. There was no proof. And if you did it at the right tide, that alcohol would float in and your people could get it anyway. So in 1933, so either way, rum runners were one way that alcohol got into the country. Now, in 1933, the U.S. was unhappy with prohibition, and they figured that the 18th Amendment was a mistake, and because people generally like drinking, they don't like their freedom taken away. Now, besides just people wanting to drink, another reason why prohibition is going to go away is because the Great Depression had struck, and now we needed to create jobs. And if you opened up the alcohol industry, you're going to create jobs. A bunch of drivers, a bunch of bartenders, saloons are going to open. So that was one thing that they did. Now, also, FDR wanted to help people. He wanted to come up with like 30 New Deal programs. And you can tax alcohol. So if you start selling alcohol, the government gets millions, billions of dollars. And FDR needed that money to fund his programs. Other people were just saying, hey, I can't believe the government's going after people drinking. There's so much real crime out there. What are they doing? Basically, people started being against the 18th Amendment. Here you have a few examples. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, on his 8th day in office, time we did something about beer. And he did. On April 7th, he passed the Cullen-Harrison Act, which basically said, it didn't get rid of prohibition. It said if you have an alcohol under 3.2%, you can start drinking it again. So spirits were still legally, but light beer you were allowed to have. Under this law, on April 8th, the very first beers were drunk by FDR. This was actually the horses that brought it to the White House, delivered him 2 crates, and that's why National Beer Day is on April 7th. Now, February 20th, 1933, there's going to be a bill in Congress to get rid of the 18th Amendment with the 21st Amendment. It takes a little time to ratify, but the 21st Amendment is passed. It gets rid of the 18th Amendment, the only time we've ever repealed an amendment. Prohibition ends as of December 5th, and here we go. Happy days are beer again. I love that image. Farewell 18th Amendment. People are glad to see it go. Now, prohibition goes away. Now, why did it fail? Well, let's talk about it. So, number one, it led to organized crime. When you ban something, it creates a black market because people still want it. So somebody's going to be willing to sell it. It's no longer that reputable person in the CVS selling it. It's now some shady person selling the illegal item. And criminals used to be kind of isolated and weak and poor. Now, criminals are gaining massive amount of power because now they can sell something that people want, and they're getting rich and powerful. They're getting larger. Also, they can't go to the police if somebody messes with them, so they have to rely on guns and violence. And now that they have so much money, they can bribe the police, bribe politicians. And so kind of the example here is don't make something illegal. It creates a black market, and then it makes these really disreputable people powerful. As an example, in Chicago, Al Capone is going to solidify power from all the criminals there. His nickname was Scarface. He got in a knife fight in New York when he was younger. He was a straight up bootlegger, and he ran so much alcohol out of Canada into the United States. And in Chicago, he ran the saloons and he ran prostitution groups, and that was what he did. Now, he also ran a racketeering gig, which basically meant, hey, you're going to sell my alcohol and nobody else's, or else. You know what? People want to burn down your business, whatever your business was. So give me money for protection. If you don't give me money, I won't protect you, and they're going to burn this place down. When in reality, if you didn't give him money, he'd burn your place down. Now, that's called racketeering, which is just another thing he did. Supposedly over 100 people died from consequences of not going along with him. And then, of course, 400 other murders happened when anybody, fought against him. Now, he became famous across the country. He gave a lot of the money he made to charitable contributions, which made the public love him He was seen as a modern day Robin Hood. I am just a businessman giving the people what they want, and I'm doing good. So, again, with all of that money, he bribed judges, politicians, police. Nobody could touch him. So in 1929, to solidify his power, so he had control over pretty much all of Chicago, he killed so many people in a rival gang. And it was known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into that. Bottom line is, in all of these murders, hundreds of them, he covered his tracks because he had people working for him that did the dirty work. So the police could never get to him. So how was he caught? Well, eventually this guy named Elliot Ness was working for the Treasury Department. And he knew that if all the police that worked for him were probably on the take, getting paid. So he went to the police academy to get his team because these police officers weren't police officers yet. So how could they already be bribed? So he picked all these new people and they worked for him and they weren't corrupt. And then he started basically raiding all the breweries and distilleries, costing Al Capone millions of dollars. Now his group, Elliot Ness's group, were known as the Untouchables because you couldn't get to them. You couldn't bribe them. They were absolutely, pretty much that's what Al Capone did to everybody, bribed him, and that's how he got control. Now Al Capone still kept his hands clean. Now that Elliot Ness wanted to get him, of course, so what did he do? He basically said, well, I can't get him for the 500 murders, which stinks. However, Al Capone is like the richest person ever with all of this illegal alcohol he's selling. But he hasn't paid any taxes because he can't pay taxes because he doesn't own any legitimate businesses. So we know he has all this wealth. So let's just charge him with tax evasion for having all this money without actually paying taxes on it. And they did. And they sentenced him to 11 years for it. And he's going to live out most of the rest of his life in a prison called Alcatraz. Now, so Prohibition is going to fail. A huge piece of that is because of all the organized crime it created. But there are other reasons. Number two, it wasn't just Al Capone. The best bootlegger ever, guy that gets a lot less attention than Al Capone, was a guy named George Remus. He was the head of an organized crime group. Now, he was considered the king of the bootleggers. Nobody made more money than him. Now, he was a lawyer, and he represented all these clients, and the clients kept bringing out these $100 bills. He's like, you guys are idiots. How do you make this much money? And they said, well, we sell illegal alcohol. So Remus was like, all right, I'm going to get in on this too. If they can do it, I can definitely do it. So he says the key here is the medicinal exception. So what he does is he starts his own drug company to help people, right? And he knows that most distilleries are located within 300 miles of Cincinnati. So he sets up shop in Cincinnati and he purchases all those closed distilleries that have all this alcohol that can't be sold. And then he says, I'm going to use it for medicinal purposes though. So he's going to send it to pharmacies. But the problem is he starts trucking all this stuff around and he hires his own men to rob himself. And then they rob the alcohol and now it disappears. And now he can sell it whatever way he wants. And that's exactly what he does. And he's covered because he says he keeps getting robbed. So he starts selling this alcohol. He had over 3,000 people working for him on this racket. That's more than twice what the government had to stop prohibition across the whole country. He made an estimated $40 million, which was a lot of money back then. So again, failure of prohibition. Why did it fail? Well, organized crime, but another reason, prohibition just wasn't possible to enforce. The people did not love it. You can't go against your own people. It just never works out. Kind of a lesson. Number four, why did prohibition fail? Well, it was underfunded. The government never put its heart into it. There were only 1,500 federal agents in the Treasury Department to enforce this. Again, Remus had twice that. They couldn't possibly cover the whole country. So they were outnumbered and they were just set up to fail. And when people are being outnumbered and they are given an impossible job and they're underpaid, they're susceptible to bribery. And that's what alcohol people did. They just kept bribing them. And nobody ever did a good job. Now, famous quote, it would require a police force of 250,000 men and a force of 200 other thousand men just to police the police in order to basically make prohibition work. And they didn't have that. So why did prohibition fail? Fifth reason, states didn't cooperate. So basically, we are a country, but we are a country of 48 states at that time. Who's supposed to actually stop people from drinking? Now, the federal government wanted states to do it. The states wanted the federal government to do it. So really, neither of them did. So Maryland is a good example. That state did not want prohibition. So they never created guidelines for their police about enforcing prohibition. So they didn't. And they never provided any money for police to enforce it. So nothing happened. And all the states did that to some degree. Sixth reason why prohibition failed is government basic apathy and hypocrisy. Warren G. Harding, who was the first president under Prohibition, he would have a bootlegger come to the White House every week to sell alcohol that served up at his weekly poker game. And that hypocrisy was well known. And Congress was drinking. Basically, the leadership was drinking. They just did not care about this. So, what are the legacy of Prohibition? Kind of things we can learn about it. The legacy, what was left behind? Well, there were some permanent changes because of Prohibition. The 19th Amendment, which came after the 18th, of course, gave women the right to vote in 1920. And why did the 19th Amendment pass? So many sexist men were like, we don't want to give women the right to vote. So many women hate alcohol. If we give women the right to vote, they'll get rid of alcohol. And we love alcohol. But once alcohol was banned, they had no reason not to give women the right to vote anymore. So by banning alcohol, these sexist men gave up hope and just voted for the 19th Amendment. So the 19th Amendment passed in part because the 18th Amendment passed. So that's a little bit of a positive legacy, kind of in an awkward way. Another legacy is our country's number one drink back then was gin and even whiskey, and even though beer was rising. Now, the gin during Prohibition was so bad because it was basically all bathtub gin made by people that weren't experts. It tasted so terrible that bartenders at speakeasies started to have to combine a bunch of sugar in with it, creating this phenomenon called mixed drink era, where now these drinks were called pansies at the time, but today there's just an endless amount of mixed drinks. And that all happened because of Prohibition to cover up the bad taste of cheap alcohol. Now, another legacy left behind. Now, the purpose of history is to actually learn lessons from things that happen so we can create a better society in the future. So we do have a couple lessons that are a little more practical from Prohibition. Lesson number one, Prohibition created an utter disregard for the law. People prior to Prohibition really had respect for the government and really had respect for the law. It was a big deal to break law. But now that there was a law that didn't make sense to people, that everybody seemed to be breaking, that now people were willing to break any law almost. Nothing is more destructive of respect for the government and the law of the land than passing laws that cannot be enforced. So by taking this on, respect for the government has been lost and has never all the way made it back. I tend to think about this when I tell my children not to do something, but no, I can't enforce it. It's almost inviting them never to respect me again. So you just can't get behind things that you can't enforce. It will impact you. And all of that disrespect will spread to everything else you do, particularly from the government. And I would say we have a healthy dose of people not following rules in our society today. So I think that starts with Prohibition. Lesson number two, Prohibition, it did kind of work. If you look, drinking decreased about 70% in the early year of it. And then it stayed 30% less than normal after that. So believe it or not, drinking actually did decrease. Here, alcohol consumption went drastically down in that first year. And then even though it went back up, it stayed lower than it was in the pre-World War I era. So it did kind of work. Now, some would say that it was a waste, it was a failure. But if you ever know that starfish story, maybe you can't throw every starfish that washes up on the beach back into the ocean. Maybe you can't save them all, but you can save some. That's that point of that story. And maybe if we could get rid of a little bit of alcohol, that's still considered a win. So is a small success still an overall success, or do you need a huge success to be happy? I think that's an important question to ask. Now, lesson three from Prohibition, we should not vote in extremes. I should not think in extremes. Now, everybody always is like, ironically, a lot of people often think everybody thinks like them, or everything is happening. People think in extremes, right? A lot of that is we surround ourselves with people that think just like us, so we think everybody thinks like us. Now, that said, an example of this is Prohibition is a failure. If you read history books, they all say that. Americans hated it. Americans loved drinking. But the reality is 8 years after Prohibition started in 1928, we had a presidential election. Herbert Hoover was against alcohol for Prohibition. And Al Smith said, no, let's get rid of Prohibition. It's bad. And Herbert Hoover destroyed Al Smith. So the reality of it is, it wasn't that clear. Our country did not hate Prohibition so much as to vote for Al Smith. So the key is that we are always divided. Things are never extreme. Things are never just one way. Yet people talk all the time that everybody's doing this, everybody's thinking that. And Prohibition is a lesson that no, history books even have it wrong. It's not always one-sided, but sometimes we surround ourselves with our reading and our friends with people that think one way. It's an important trap not to fall into. Lesson number four from Prohibition. Prohibition was very inequitable, and the textbooks kind of ignore this as well. Basically, the rich may have their booze for a lifetime guaranteed, and the right of the worker to get a glass of beer is denied to him. And that was right. Basically, the rich stocked up on alcohol and had it for 13 years, and the poor couldn't go into saloons to get beer, which is where they drank. So prohibition did not impact everybody the same, and that's not so equitable. So the lesson here is to be careful. When people implement a law, they often think cause effect, and they think of it one-dimensionally. In reality, you have to look how your decisions or the decisions of laws impact different groups, because it always impacts people differently. And people don't often think that. They say, well, if I do this, then this will happen. Really, you got to break the this into different groups and see how it impacts people differently. And I think in these days, that's becoming abundantly clear. So another lesson of prohibition is to do with arrests, our criminal justice system. Suddenly, the federal government, not local towns, took over control of arresting people for federal laws. A massive increase by the tens of thousands of people that were arrested if you look under this chart. So suddenly our criminal justice system, federally speaking, was born. And our justice system is going to get overwhelmed. It's tens of thousands of people that were getting arrested that never before were getting arrested. And it couldn't handle it. So this new concept since Prohibition was established called the plea bargain. It wasn't just guilty, then punishment. Now our courts couldn't handle all these people being arrested, so you were encouraged to take a plea. Basically, hey, if I convict you, I'm going to put you away for 5 years, but if you take this plea, agree to a lesser crime, I'll only put you away for 1. And today, it's something like 98% of people charged with crimes agree to a compromise, a plea bargain. And the problem with this, the problem with our plea bargain system is everybody who's arrested, whether they're innocent or not, is highly pressured, highly threatened that if they don't take the plea, they're going to go to prison for such a long time. And that encourages both guilty and innocent people to plead guilty so they aren't convicted in a regular trial. So people in our country, pretty much at 98% of the accused, do not have a chance to go to court, or should I say they don't go to court to prove their innocence. And this leads to a lot of innocent people in our criminal justice system plea bargaining to have smaller sentences. In reality, innocent people are going to jail, and this impacts lower classes at a higher rate. And it all started with Prohibition, this whole plea bargaining situation that we have in our criminal justice system. Lesson number 6 from Prohibition, KKK growth. The KKK grew exponentially in the 1920s, and that was because of Prohibition. Now, the lesson here is the unintended consequences of things. Now, the reason the KKK grew was because it was seen as un-American to be drinking. Again, people connected it with immigration and these new people coming in. So the KKK often marched side by side, protesting people that were drinking next to other groups, like the Anti-Saloon League. So the KKK was enforcing prohibition in some cases against those un-American people. And they were seen as the good people defending traditional America from these alcohol-abusing lawbreakers. So a lot of people joined the KKK in a way to enforce prohibition and fight that un-Americanism. So prohibition helped the KKK grow. Now, the lesson from this is when you make decisions or laws, you really can't just think about simple cause and effect. You have to think about unintended consequences, because things are going to happen that you don't intend. And you got to try to think of those, because a lot of times the unintended consequences can be a lot worse than what you intended to begin with, like the KKK growing. Lesson number 7 from Prohibition. Our states used to make most of their money off excise taxes on alcohol. And once Prohibition happened, they lost all that money, $11 billion lost. So what did they do? States started implementing state income taxes, not just federal. And today, here's the map of how much we're all paying. In Massachusetts, 5%, just even more taxes. Once again, they didn't establish Prohibition thinking, hey, once we get rid of alcohol, now people are going to have to pay a lot more taxes. It's just an unintended consequence. And people that can anticipate unintended consequences and account for them are just so much more successful in life. You can't just get trapped in, I'm going to do this, and this is why. You got to think about what might happen that you're not thinking about. So sometimes solutions that are worse than the problems they set out to solve. So again, lesson number 8 from Prohibition. People get fired up all the time to solve a problem, and certainly drinking is a massive problem, right? People get fired up and they're like, we need to get rid of drinking. And that leads to problems. So a lot of people choose extreme action like banning all alcohol because that would solve their problem. But the lesson here is maybe extreme action is not the best choice. Maybe there are more casual or moderate choices to face problems. So for instance, a lot of times when you take an extreme action against an enemy or against an idea that you don't like, it actually has the opposite effect. It mobilizes the opposition. So alcohol is bad, and there were a bunch of things we could have done to address the bad, but instead by banning all the alcohol, it mobilized millions of people that supported alcohol that otherwise weren't working together to bring it back and to disobey the law. So a lot of times the moderate course is significantly more effective at dealing with a problem than the extreme one. But yet emotionally we want the extreme. This is bad, get rid of it. Now we could have, for prohibition, for example, we could have done a sin tax, make all alcohol more expensive, and that would get less drinking, right? Limit it. We could have just got rid of spirits, those really high percentage alcohol things like whiskey, because those do the most damage. Beer doesn't get people as drunk as fast, things like that. Could have done that. We could have got rid of the saloons instead of just banning all alcohol, and then people could have drank at home and not surrounded by other people to get all riled up. We could have done that, and that could have got rid of some of the debauchery and terribleness. All of those courses, the moderate course sometimes is more effective at meeting goals. And a lot of people criticize prohibition for that. They say, no, I was for prohibition, but I thought they were going to still let me drink at home, let me buy alcohol. I thought they were just getting rid of the saloon. So the extreme decision could have hurt the prohibition goal. Lesson number 9, one of our last. Some states actually remained dry after the 21st Amendment. South Carolina remained dry, North Carolina, all these other states ignored it. So some states, after prohibition was lifted, actually stayed with prohibition for a while. Most got rid of it eventually and embraced freedom. But in 1966, Mississippi was one of the last states to bring alcohol back. They had prohibition all the way up to 1966. In 1987, Kansas still had no saloons, no bars. Bars were still illegal in Kansas up until, again, 1987. That's not that long ago. But then, of course, they became legal in 87. So prohibition lingered. It lasted. In 2013, these are still Massachusetts towns that exist that on the right here, Alfred, that are still dry. They don't allow alcohol. You can't sell it and so on. So there's still elements of prohibition that still exist in the country. And of course, the final lesson that's limited to what I just said. Maybe let federalism and democracy work. And what I mean by that is, rather than telling everybody that, like kind of like a God, you will not drink alcohol, maybe allow freedom and democracy. Let people vote for themselves. So when we let people vote, you had all these, like I said, if you look back, all these states that chose to get rid of alcohol and all these towns and counties that still do even today. So perhaps the choice of forcing people is just never that successful. But if it's truly a good thing, the people will choose it for themselves. Let democracy work. As individual towns, counties, and states, let them choose what's right for them. That would be maybe one lesson. By forcing everybody to get rid of it, it certainly kind of killed the idea a little bit. People don't like to be forced. Kind of a final thought. Should the government attempt to prohibit immoral behavior? So again, should the government have done prohibition? Should it be trying to control people's behavior? Now, Ronald Reagan, president of the 80s, said the government's first duty is to protect the people, not to run their lives. So he would say no. Prohibition, drinking is up to the people, not the government. Of course, progressives would respond, sometimes people need to be protected from themselves. And I think the audience here has to decide which of those 2 points of view do you agree with. So this was an extensive presentation on prohibition. Hope you're doing well. Look for your assignment on Google Classroom.